I will speak today about our joint paper that we wrote with Avi and with Casey recently and published in European Transactions on Telecommunications. It's called Internet Expansion, Refinement, and Churn. It is a subject in which several people have been working very productively, and let me mention them immediately. If you want to be able to follow the screen, there is a URL which is now at CADA, www.cada.org/broido NANOG 2002.egr.pdf, or PS is also there. www.cada.org/broido NANOG 2002.egr. So let me start with acknowledgement, since many people really contributed a lot. And of course, we owe a lot to Dave Meyer, who started this wonderful collection of route views 5 years ago. And then Jeff Houston, of course, was the first person to ask many questions, which I will discuss here, although our answers can be different or maybe similar in many respects. And Sean McCreary taught me analysis of BGP table. I, of course, owe a lot to Sean. Bill Woodcock also taught me a lot about operational issues. And thanks to Chingiz for several discussions, and to Sean Daran and to KDLs who helped to make this presentable. Yeah, so part one, motivation. So there are several routing concerns which I'm going to discuss here. But most important, of course, is network stability. And then there is S number exhaustion, IP addresses depletion, and IP space fragmentation. So that's about trends on the internet, but mostly about the size of BGP tables and related issues. So there are router constraints like processing power limitation. We probably don't want to put a router in a big fridge in order to process all updates in real time as they flow in droves. And there are memory limitations. We cannot put a router in a wristwatch so far. So the growth of the BGP table strains both of those limitations. It requires both processing power and both memory. And it affects equipment costs of the ISPs, primarily route computation, network stability, and router stability. Why router stability? Olaf already touched on that. Let me show you another plot from the same series. This is the plot of BGP updates as they flow through a route views update collector. Black dots are route announcements, and red are withdrawals from 22 routers. So you can clearly see that there is a lot of normal background noise sub-functioning. And this normal background noise can be distinguished by diurnal and weekly patterns of change. It goes down on weekend and goes up on Wednesday, in the middle of the week. But then there are also updits all over the place, over approximately a level of 50,000 updates per 15 minutes. There is a separate group of highly intensive update flows, which correspond to session resets and likely events when more than half, say, of BGP table is transmitted in 15 minutes. So this is the most stressful for the router. And this actually can result in the following meltdown scenario. When neighbor session resets, many full tables arrive at once, there is a surge in processing load, and router crash and contributes to more session resets. So the domino effect starts all over the core, and the core burns out. The likelihood of this event grows out, of course, with table size. So let's look at the facets of change of tables and of the internet as we can see it through BGP tables. So there are several colors in the spectrum of change. There is expansion of tables. There is refinement of granularity. There is sophistication of organization of different objects which are covered by routing. And there is churn, and of course part of the chain is stability, which is zero change. So we discovered several trends and patterns which lie basically on the surface of things, But because they are so obvious, probably no one has paid attention to them before. There are lots and lots of network invariants floating around. Many ratios are surprisingly stable or change very slowly. And the Internet undergoes proportionate growth in many respects. In particular, in BGP table size, the prefix and their growth slowed in 2002, and we found that small ISPs do not contribute much growth or much churn either. And the route updates per prefix decrease, as Cengiz has shown on the previous NANOG. And we also see that Internet demand changes with economy, and Internet growth is kind of covariant with economy. It is hard to say how much cause and effect relationship is there, but clearly there is a covariance. And IP address growth was uneven in these 4 or 5 years that we analyzed, and mostly slow growth since '97. But more specific addresses, more specific routes, had much faster growth of the covered address space. And IP fragmentation grew in a reasonable, coordinated way. So the time frame for data analysis is '97 to 2002, and we analyzed the BGP tables from our user set and sample them every 6 months, although we could also sample every 2 hours. That's the granularity of route view updates, current granularity. But I wouldn't have time to speak about that. It is sampled in November and May because the route user started in November. And only full-size tables taken, no filtered tables. And from those full-size tables, prefixes carried by most peers. So for each peer, we take majority vote. For each prefix, we take majority vote by all peers. If majority of the peers sees it, then we call it semi-global prefix. And another specific minor detail that unstable /8, unstable class A nets in 60 to 69 range are removed. Otherwise, the counts of more specific become almost impossible to determine. So table size is essentially a product. It's a number of routes per times per route state. So this per route state depends upon the number of ASs in the route, in the AS path. It is path length plus prepending. And also on the number of communities and other attributes, which more or less constant. Communities may grow, and this poses, of course, certain threat to the growth of BGP tables. So the bottom line is that table can grow even when the number of routes is absolutely constant. And the NANOG mailing list in August 2001, through several contributors, several operational folks, have estimated that it is between 150 and 180 bytes per route currently in the BGP table, in the RIB. So this estimate translates into 16 to 20 megabytes per RIB. So when several RIBs arrive, of course, the bandwidth consumption and the processing consumption on the router may increase significantly. So let's start counting routes. So this is the factor 1 in our table. Huh?
Since you've got so many interesting statistics, would it be possible to ask questions midstream, or should I wait till the end?
Which question do you want?
May I ask a question at this time?
Of course.
Okay. If you go back to your previous slide, that would be most helpful.
Okay.
Well, the routing table size. Was this per AFI-SAFI pair, and are you seeing any of the pairs based in the VPN technology in your examination of the route tables?
I don't think we see much of.
Do you know why that is?
I think because we are not part of route use peering sets.
So you're not seeing the VPN based?
Yeah, I am not 100% sure though. We did not do analysis whether, say, a peer or whether a specific AS is VPN.
Okay, so you did it just based on the unicast AFI pair. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is the curve. It used to look menacing since it bended upwards, but since about a year and a few months ago, it started bending downwards. And actually, right now, this is the number of routes in a full-size table. The number of routes in full-size table is currently between 103,000 207,000. And the number of routes in the union of all tables from route used is about 114,000. So you see that a lot of routes are actually carried only locally, since it's about 10,000 more in the union than in each table. And that is why semi-global prefixes help, since they filter out locally carried routes. And if you look at it from a curve fitting perspective, you can actually see that it is close to logistic curve. And logistic curves were discovered in the United States in early 19th century by, I forgot honestly the name of a mathematician. But it is a generic shape for a transfer, for any transfer. It's, for example, tech transfer, like the change from steam engines to locomotives. And the differential equation looks like that. If the growth is equal to product of those who have the technology times those who don't have the technology. Those who have it, they attract those who don't have by demonstrating the advantages of this technology. So the growth, the largest growth, is when the numbers are approximately equal of those who have and those who don't have. So it's like contagious gadgets. It's like epidemics of technology spreading over population and finally going to the saturation point. Of course, it's hard to say whether what we see currently in the growth of the table is a temporary phenomenon or it is really pointing toward the saturation. And I wouldn't vouch for that. So more likely cause of this particular slowdown is high prefix dropout rate, which we see in route view tables all the time. It has really increased. And the particular numbers for churn can be seen in our IETF slides, which are on CADA website. So summations of prefix count can be split, prefix count can be split into three different groups. Those are standalone prefixes, which cover the interval just once, more specific prefixes, which are subsets of other prefixes, and then root prefixes or aggregates, which contain more specifics, but are not subsets of any other prefixes. And I will call it top prefixes, standalones plus roots, since those are the prefixes which contain IP addresses and which count them every address one time. So more specific, it turns out that statistically, more specifics, say, and /24s and multi-home diases and more specifics are independent. It is surprising, since people always assume, say, that multi-home diases produce more specifics, or more specifics are more likely to be /24s. But it's, in fact, that it turns out that having one property does not increase the probability of another. Yeah. So let me show you these several curves, in which the top one is the curve for all prefixes, or all semi-global prefixes. And the three curves below are the blue curve is the curve of more specifics. The green curve is the curve of standalone prefixes, and the red curve is the curve of root prefixes. So right now we have a situation in which two curves met. So essentially we have about as many standalone and root prefixes. Of course you cannot see a difference of a couple of thousand here. But top prefixes and all top prefixes and all more specific prefixes are approximately equal. There are 50.3% more specific prefixes in the semi-global set. But another interesting thing is that root prefixes are growing much faster than the rest. And this is a manifestation of the refinement phenomenon, of which I will speak later. Yeah, actually this yellow curve that you see on top of those is the curve of /24s. How many /24s were in the semi-global set. So it is about the same, it is slightly more. Currently it is at around 55-56% of the table. It used to be closer to 57, but still fairly stable through all these 4 years. Yeah, so we clearly see prefix growth slow down, and it is present in all three summations. So the question is whether it's caused by economy or not. The internet bubble burst in November 2000, as we all know, and since then many net ventures failed, and it was of course compounded by September 11th event. Is it a coincidence or is there some cause and effect relation? I don't know, but I'm inclined to believe that there is. So prefix growth slowdown did not really affect much, did not completely wipe out business customers who connect to the internet. On the average, about 6,000 new prefixes appear in the table per month. But the drop rate really next. So, for example, October 2000 count of prefixes is equal to February 2000. In about 3 months, we didn't have increase in the table. And most prefixes were stable since September 2000 and even decreased slightly. And smallest global blocks /24 were either stable or down since August 2001. So the drop rate used to be 1/2 of the net growth rate in 1990s. Now drop rate is equal to the growth rate, and this is why the size of the table is stable. Now let me speak about topological state growth, since this involves also AS path length, which is another factor in the product of the table size. There is growth in AS, number of AS paths, but there is no growth in AS path length, as I will show, and there is also average variance, prepending, and AS edges. Growth is convenient to measure by ratios, since ratios are much stabler than the absolute numbers. So AS paths to AS's ratio in the table relates to topological diversity or redundancy of particular peer. AS path length average is also essentially a ratio. It is the number of non-prepended AS tokens in the table divided by the number of routes. It's related to the memory consumption. The variance of AS path length is related to how many choices BGP protocol has for selecting routes, since BGP path selection is still largely AS path length based. So this plot shows the number of AS paths in the top curve and the number of ASs in the bottom curve. It's clear that the variance has the same property. It's also maxing out and going on the kind of logistic curve. But what is also interesting is that the number of ASs is growing slow enough, so if we would project, say, linear growth, we would still have enough ASs for the next 10 years if linear growth persists. This particular graph shows the ratio between AS path count and ASs per 40 peers in route use. So this ratio appears to decrease since 2000, and this probably shows that only best paths are selected for all prefixes with the same origin AS. But essentially, the decrease is very slow. So the ratio was close to 1.25 and was between 1.25, 1.3 through all these years. That's why the curves look almost flat. Then many ratios, as I said, are stable. For example, the average number of AS neighbors grows very slowly and currently is about 2 or 2.06. AS path length can, of course, change when you change an upstream provider with significant difference in connectivity towards the backbone. But usually it doesn't, and many ASs have stable path length distribution. And AS path length diversity also is near constant, even if, say, you measure the entropy of the distribution of AS path length. This is also constant. I won't show it here. Prepending is reasonably low throughout all 4 years. It is neither growing nor decreasing. It's about 5.5% of AS tokens and lines in the BGP table. So this is the slide that Casey already showed you. I just want to mention that this is the second factor of routing table size. And these are five plots taken in 3 years, 5 distributions. All distributions basically look the same. It's only the number of AS paths that is increasing, so they slightly go up. But the proportion of AS paths is constant. It's only the number of AS paths that grows. And average AS path length for 40 peers remained stable throughout years, or made some unpredictable changes, which really does not fit any visible trend. Standard deviation was also about the same, was about constant at around 1, and appeared to decrease in the beginning of the period, but shows no visible trend. It is important that we have enough spread in AS path length, otherwise BGP will lose its ability to distinguish paths on the basis of their length. And a lot of traffic engineering is using that. Yeah. So AS number exhaustion, let me elaborate a little bit on that. The largest AS number assigned is currently about 25,000. So half of those numbers are routed, about 12.5 thousand, close to 13,000 even. And about 5 new ASs are announced per day. So the maximum is over 64,000. So it will suffice for a few years depending upon the type of growth. Eventually we will have implementation of 32-bit AS numbers, but I personally don't know how fast it is going to happen. And it will not, of course, decrease the growth in ASs. Probably they will explode after that. And probably every normal person will have their own AS number by then. Yeah, like every net geek used to have an email in the beginning of 90s. Yeah. So there is an interesting phenomenon though of refinement of prefixes, which is the getting smaller and smaller number of prefixes per AS on the average. It used to be that prefix growth rate was 2/3 of AS growth rate, and currently it is less than 1/2. And which means the prefixes to AS ratio is steadily decreasing. Currently it is decreasing much faster than it was before the internet bubble burst. So now the number of prefixes per AS is about 8. And it is probably easy to predict that eventually that there will be less than 1 prefix per AS. Currently there are about 80 ASs which are only transit, which do not announce any net. So this means that the benefits of any granularity reduction from prefixes to origin ASs and the similar concepts like, say, the concept of BGP atoms, which I introduced a couple of years ago, will gradually disappear. The benefits of these concepts will gradually disappear. This curve shows how the prefix to AS refinement used to work before current super refinement trend. It is an interesting formula which connected the number of prefixes to the number of ASs, and it is very simple. It is 200 times the number of ASs to the power of 2/3. So the number of prefixes in this global table is that formula. If you look at it from the viewpoint of physical chemistry, then you can say that the reaction that goes between prefixes and ASs converts 3 prefixes to 2 ASs. That's how it should work. Yeah. So currently, in terms of route origination, there is a huge disparity. That 40% of ASs originate only 1 prefix, and they contribute 5% of prefixes. 1% of ASs originate 100 or more prefixes, and those ASs contribute 32%. So these statistics were same in November 2001 and February 2002. So this means essentially that small ISPs do not contribute to table growth. But the disparity changes slowly, and relatively fewer ASs are origin of many prefixes. This reflects again AS refinement, prefix refinement phenomenon. This curve shows what are the probabilities of having, say, a number of prefixes larger than given per number. Say 100 prefixes, what is the probability of having an AS if all ASs are counted as 1? Every AS is counted as with probability 1. This probability of 1 divided by number of ASs. So it shows essentially that these probabilities of large counts are gradually going down. So this is another manifestation of refinement. So let me discuss now trends in IPv4 address space use. There is, of course, consumption, refinement, sophistication, and fragmentation. And this is important for prefix growth because new top prefixes in our measurement between December 2000 and 2001 were arising, 50% of new top prefixes were arising from new address blocks, and 37% were arising through the aggregation of existing prefixes. Much smaller numbers were arising through aggregation or expansion of existing prefixes. And IP addresses consumption slowed down considerably in mid-90s, where routing registries like ARIN or APNIC or RIPE introduced strict policies of giving away IP addresses. Currently, about 27 of potential IP addresses in IPv4 address space are globally routed, and close to about one-half are allocated or assigned, which means that about 2/5 or 40% of allocated and assigned addresses are not globally routed. They may be used for purposes of local routing, or they may be used just as supply of IP addresses for future, which people keep in their networks and don't use. Yearly growth has been uneven, as I mentioned, and in '98 it was 10% growth in IP addresses in global set. In '99 it was 7%, then in 2000 it was about 1%, and recently it was 4.6%. So if you assume yearly growth of 7%, which is clearly over the average of these numbers, and 40% overhead of local addresses and current semi-global coverage, then IPv4 space can also potentially last another 10 years. Yeah. So IPv4 space evolution was interesting though in these years, since the number of addresses in different groups of prefixes was moving in the opposite way. Addresses in standalone blocks were decreasing, whereas addresses in the root blocks were growing, and addresses in more specific blocks were growing fastest. So we see an instance of sophistication when nested prefixes replace standalone simple prefixes. This graph shows exactly that. So the top curve, which is in black, is the total number of addresses. The red curve is the number of standalones, and the upward going, the next curve is the number of addresses in root prefixes, and the bottom curve is the number of addresses in more specifics. It doesn't show, of course, how large is the growth, but it is much larger. It's about 40% a year as compared to, say, 4% a year. Yeah, it's 30 to 40% a year. So churn was also pretty high in IP addresses. It is not always understood that the Internet grows as a living organism when new cells appear and many old cells die. So the death rate of the Internet is about equal to its birth rate. In particular, between November 2000 and November 2001, there were 120 million new IP addresses and 70 million dropped IP addresses. So net growth was 50 million addresses. And it shows that drop rate was actually higher than net growth rate. And this relates also, as I said, to prefixes. Even in the best times of prefix growth, the drop rate was about half of the growth rate. Then there is, of course, a refinement of address space. In the end of '90s, prefixes grew much faster than addresses, and the average number of addresses per prefix decreased steadily. In the recent time, this trend has somewhat slowed, and two growths were comparable, so no significant refinement in terms of the decrease of the average size of address block was observable. But there was a certain amount of sophistication in terms of growth of the number of different intervals which are covered with the different numbers of blocks. If you have a hole which is punched in an address block, then when customer changes its prefix, this is a hole. This is a smaller prefix in a larger provider prefix. When a customer changes provider and keeps a prefix, then the provider has a reason to deaggregate, and it should subdivide the remaining pieces, the left one and the right one, into cider blocks. So this is how, as I said, 37% of new prefixes, or about that much, appear in the table. Yeah. Then there are many intervals are covered by several prefixes. In potential, of course, an IP address can be covered by up to 32 prefixes, but in reality the maximum is 6. So we have prefix tower of various length and of various content of prefixes. And the intervals are give us lower bound for the number of prefixes which would arise in total deaggregation, making all more specifics into standalone blocks. So this interval count is generated by shifted and skipped more specifics in root blocks. So this curve shows how these intervals are actually growing. The black curve is again the number of prefixes, the lower curve, and the upper curve is the number of intervals. So it shows that intervals are growing in proportion. So there is no reason to panic. And the lower curve, the blue curve, is the number of gaps in IP address space. This is another measure, interesting measure of fragmentation in IP space. So this is the same in log scale. I just wanted to show that there is a constant distance between two curves. So there is a constant factor between intervals and prefixes. It is again about 1.25. It's a magic number. Yeah. Now this curve also shows that the proportionality constant is about 1.25. So IP space usage undergoes sophistication, but this sophistication is proportionate to the number of prefixes. If all prefixes, if all more specifics were deaggregated, all holes punched by more specifics were deaggregated, we would get 75,000 new routes. So it is only if we would do most economic deaggregation, then say the complement of /24 and /16 is deaggregated into 7 blocks. Normally people would deaggregate it into 255 blocks, as all of you know. And then we would really have an explosion of the table. So fact of the matter is that more specifics save routing table from explosion, which I think not everyone realizes in this audience. Then this fragmentation in IP space, which makes that gaps, which means that gaps are growing when, say, more specifics or individual standalone blocks are dropped and no longer announced, makes, of course, address space management much harder for routing registries, and effectively makes fragments over IP address space unusable. The growth of the gaps, of course, depends on the way the address space is managed, but it also is a seasonal phenomenon. It turns out that there was excessive gap growth in November 2000 to May 2000. Then in about 6 months, the number of gaps grew to the same amount as in 2 previous years. This was exactly the time when many networks dropped from the internet, due to the higher rate. I assume it is due to the higher rate of smaller blocks. So local IP space can also be sometimes can process gaps. So my conclusion is that internet growth has slowed in the recent 2 years, in 2001, 2002, when economy slowed down too. And this current growth was marked by very high drop rate or churn of the prefixes, ASs, and IP addresses. It was a concerted growth, though, since many ratios were constant. And it was also accompanied by granularity refinement in ASs, root prefixes, and address blocks. So it looks like we have a breathing space now, but who knows for how long. And let me come up with a few suggestions that we can use this breathing space for. Let's make routing more network friendly and avoid bandwidth waste by circuitous routes. Let's make delay and loss and jitter and bandwidth BGP parameters so that we could optimize really paths on the basis of that and not only on the basis of AS paths. And then let's think about in-band micropayments beyond peering links. And can we view routes as an economic indicator? Yeah. So thank you very much for your attention. Javier?
If you could go back to the last slide.
Okay.
The one line there about making delay, loss, jitter, bandwidth, BGP parameters is a really cool one. But I'm not sure that my brain is big enough to understand how that would actually work. Just because if you move in that direction, just the whole idea of what you have to do to dampen the oscillations that you could get, because those things change much more frequently even than the topology that we already have problems tracking the change of and dealing with the churn in.
Yes.
So have you given some serious thought to how you could do that?
I mean, of course, some average standard numbers, like say an average for say 24 hours. I don't mean instantaneous values of this quantity.
Okay. Are people at CADA looking at that as a simulation, or sort of saying what?
No, we haven't yet done any simulation.
Okay. That would be very interesting.
Yes, all right. Come to us and we can do it. Other questions?